Hey, deserving listeners, it's time to continue watching The Me You Can't See, which is Oprah interviewing people about mental health issues. Let's watch.
One of the really relatable things that I believe that so many people go through is, firstly, the admittance that something is wrong and the need to ask for help. Now, everyone's different, but what I've learned from that is it's not what's wrong with you, it's what's happened to you. And I think that is such an important point.
Wow. 2 thumbs up, Harry. Absolutely. Well put. I've never heard it put that way, but yeah, that is a very, very strong foundation in my understanding of how people work, which is it's not what's wrong with you, it's what's happened to you. That is a profound statement. I wonder if he invented that, because if he did, I'm going to use that a lot. And what does he mean by that? Well, we will typically feel depressed, or we'll have grief, or we'll have anxiety, or we'll have distress from trauma being triggered. And we say to ourselves, what's wrong with me? There's something wrong. I need a diagnosis. I need a pill. I need something to make me not broken anymore. Instead of asking the question, what has happened to me so that I'm having this reaction right now? 99% of the time in my practice, that is the conceptualization that we find to be accurate, rather than what's wrong with you, let's try to fix you, you're broken, let's change you. And with the perspective of what's happened to you, then it's about how can we help you with those traumas? How can we help you recover? How can we help you process those feelings? How can we give you support? How can we change the meanings that for example, one thing that can happen to you is you're treated badly by your family, and you draw a conclusion that there's something wrong with you and that you're broken or you're not lovable and that you can't trust other people. And so you operate in the world from that perspective, and your life goes down a negative road. And then at some point you say, oh, what's wrong with me? And people are like, what's wrong with you? Instead of, what happened to me? What happened to me was I was treated as though I was worthless, and now I act as if I'm worthless, which is why my life is this way. And so when we have that accurate conceptualization, then we can go back to what happened to them, and we can help them to rework those meanings. The meaning that we would want, one possible other meaning that you can come from that situation is, oh, there wasn't anything wrong with me. There was something different, or my family was struggling with something so that they dumped a lot on me. That's a much different story, right?
My therapist turned around to me and said, that sounds like you reverting to 12-year-old Harry. I felt somewhat ashamed and defensive. Like, how dare you? You're calling me a child. And she was, I'm not calling you a child. I'm expressing sympathy and empathy for you, for what happened to you when you were a child. You never processed it. You were never allowed to talk about it. And all of a sudden now it's coming up in different ways as projection.
So that is fantastic. I'm so happy for Harry that he was able to have, so one way of saying his story, and I show all the clips, is he was stuffing his emotions. He was stuffing his emotions. The family were telling him to stuff his emotions. Society was telling him to stuff his emotions. Toxic masculinity was telling him to stuff his emotions. And then everything came out, and he didn't talk about what he went through, but I'm guessing it was something very, very difficult, because he said he went to physicians, he went to therapists, he went to alternative therapists, he went to psychiatrists, so I'm guessing that he was suffering quite a bit. Maybe with suicidality, maybe with a lot of anxiety, maybe mood, maybe anger, something. Maybe a lot of physical symptoms, hard to know. Trouble concentrating, trouble sleeping, who knows? A lot of drinking, he talks about that. A lot of people will drink as a way of trying to numb their feelings. I suspect that most people who chronically drink or even binge drink are trying to numb their feelings, even if it's just the feelings they had earlier that day. But anyway, so for Harry, he was seeking help, and then he was with Megan, right? That's her name, Megan. And they had a big fight, and Megan said, I think you should talk with a therapist. And good on Harry for going. It was quite a Y in the road there, right? Quite a crossroad. What if he didn't go to therapy? And he goes, and then the therapist is like, I'm seeing a part of you that is 12, a hurt part of you. He gets defensive. This therapist works really well with that, says, no, I'm not insulting you. I'm not saying you're 12. I'm saying there's a part of you that is 12, and I have a tremendous amount of empathy and sympathy for that. And that was the beginning of the healing process for him, where he could actually go back to when he was 12 and feel the feelings that were left unfelt. And this really makes me feel terrible for a lot of the royals and really people all over the world who have a lot of pressure on themselves to stuff their feelings and aren't allowed to do that. So good on Harry for being able to do that. And then eventually that led to a road that caused him to want to leave the family, which from what I understand, he's doing that for his own mental health and his family's mental health.
Photographed, chased, harassed. The clicking of cameras and the flashes of cameras makes my blood boil. It makes me angry. It takes me back to what happened to my mum and what I experienced when I was a kid.
That's enough.
But it went to a whole new depth with not just traditional media, but also social media platforms as well.
It's interesting. I wonder if for Harry, it seems like it's possible that when he was being attacked, he would just stuff his feelings. But watching his wife, his fiancée, his girlfriend, his loved one being attacked unfairly, and perhaps a lot more than he was being attacked, then that's when he was like, wait, this isn't okay. It's one thing when it's happening to me. It's another thing when it's happening to her. And actually, why is it happening to me? And that was what caused him to say, what is happening right now? This is not healthy. I cannot live this way anymore.
She hadn't lost it. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't self-medicating, be it through pills or through alcohol. She was absolutely sober. She was completely sane. Yet in the quiet of night, these thoughts woke her up.
Yeah, good. Harry's a very good storyteller, I will say, and a keen observer of humans, because for him to be able to describe it, he would have to observe it and note it. And this is something that is misunderstood. People will see people who have thoughts about hurting themselves, killing themselves, and will say, oh, they must be out of their mind. They must be insane. They must be crazy. And certainly some people who do have thoughts like that are suffering from what we call severe mental illnesses. But the vast majority of people, they're resorting to that thought, that action, because of the amount of suffering that they are going through. And a lot of people might look at Meghan and say, what suffering? She has it all. She's famous. She's rich. She's going to marry into the British royal family. Everything's fine. She's beautiful. She's an actor. She's successful. What does she have to feel bad about? Well, I think all of us understand after watching this show and watching the interviews with Meghan and Harry with Oprah earlier this year, and all the other countless, Anthony Bourdain, Chris Cornell, so many people who seemingly have it all and yet are extremely sad and suffering. So we need to get rid of that idea that only crazy people think about those kinds of things. A lot of people, unfortunately, are thinking about those kinds of things. And once we release the stigma and normalize it, it will promote more people stepping forward and getting the help that they need.
EMDR is always something that I wanted to try. And that was one of the varieties of different forms of healing or curing that I was willing to experiment with. And I never would have been open to that had I not put in the work and the therapy that I've done over the years.
Okay, so EMDR, you can listen to my past episode in which I think it's patron only, where I go into detail about it. I don't use that form of therapy myself, but I know enough about the form of therapy and its principles to be able to speak about it. In general, what it is it is a protocol that is what we call evidence-based, meaning that there's sufficient evidence that when you use it well, you can have a pretty good chance that there will be positive outcomes for the client. Typically, it's used for trauma, for PTSD. There will be some sort of stimulation on your body or your visual or your vision, stimulation of the brain that will go back and forth. You will look to the left, you'll look to the right, you'll look to the left, you'll look to the right. Or you might squeeze something in each hand, squeeze, squeeze, squeeze. There's various different ways of doing it, while remembering a trauma that you have gone through. Over time, this has been shown to help people to reduce their PTSD symptoms and facilitate their trauma recovery. That's usually what people really focus on, is the eye movement. But it's important to note that the protocol for EMDR only uses the eye movement in a small sliver, a percentage of the overall protocol. There's a lot of just regular talk therapy, regular trauma therapy, where you work on emotions, you work on meaning making, you work on developing a relationship with your therapist. It's not just this eye movement thing.
So what EMDR does is that it pairs the cognitive recollection of the trauma with a powerful memory of being safe. You want to be able to think about the traumatic event without having the emotional distress associated with that.
Yeah, this is great that they're focusing on EMDR, but it actually is a pet peeve of mine that whenever people talk about trauma recovery, 90% of the time, anecdotally in my life, people bring up EMDR. EMDR is, it's available and it works for some people. But more importantly, there is a general approach to trauma, and you can listen to my episodes on, I think I titled them Trauma Therapy, that are actually more flexible to the client. The model that I use is a version of prolonged exposure, but it has a lot of caveats with it. I don't follow the strict prolonged exposure protocol because every client is different. Some clients I have treated PTSD in 3 sessions. I have gone through all of the steps, maybe 3 is an overexaggeration, maybe 5, 7 sessions. Other clients, I will treat them for 7, 8, 9, 10 years, and we're halfway through the protocol that I use because of all the complications, dissociation, life events, the amount of trauma, personality disorders, transference issues, disorganized attachment style, fearful attachment style. There are so many complicating factors that are often present with people who have complicated trauma, who have personality disorders, who have childhood relational traumas, that you can't just apply a 20, 25-week protocol and say, okay, well, we're done. It just never works out that way. Now, I guess people like this show, and even in my own field, will turn to EMDR because it just feels easier to, we have this thing called EMDR, and yes, it does work. It does help. There's some debate, by the way, as to whether or not the eye movement or the stimulation back and forth is even a part of the change, because like I was saying earlier, there's a lot, the eye movement part or the hand squeezing part is actually, like I said, a small part of it. And I don't use that bilateral stimulation element in my trauma therapy, but I use a lot of the there's a lot of coinciding elements in EMDR that I use, but I use it in a more flexible way based on what the client is providing to me. Because like I said, some people only need 7 sessions and some people need 7 years, depending on their issues. So it's a pet peeve of mine that they always bring up EMDR rather than talking about the broader field of trauma therapy. Because one, clinicians will watch a show like this and walk away with, trauma, if someone has PTSD or complex PTSD, then I do EMDR. And if I'm not trained in EMDR, then I guess I have no other options. And that is not a good thing for therapists to do. Therapists should understand, no, there's a lot. There's cognitive processing, which is also another limited session. There's trauma-focused CBT, which is also a limited session. But there's also this thing called flexible, maybe I should come up with a term for it. Flexible prolonged exposure, flexible emotional awareness regulation, prolonged exposure. And it works. I mean, trauma therapy works. It is a wonderful thing. There's not a lot of things that therapists can say that we are pretty good at treating, but trauma, we're pretty good at it if you do it in a responsible, flexible way. The other thing is that clients will say, I have trauma, I need EMDR, rather than looking for someone that might be more flexible to their needs.
Comfortable. And of course, for me, London is a trigger, unfortunately, because of what happened to my mum and because of what I experienced and what I saw.
Happens every time.
So can you remember the first time it happened?
No, I can't remember the first time it happened. I just remember the feeling, almost anxiety, like a hollow, empty feeling of almost nervousness of...
So kudos to Harry for not only being on this show, but also showing what it's like to go through therapy. There's nothing more powerful as a normalizer than saying, look, we can talk about the fact that I'm in therapy. Why don't we just show me in therapy so everyone in the audience can be like, look, this is what therapy looks like. It's not that bad. So 2 huge thumbs up to Harry for this and, being vulnerable and leading the way. This is great.
everything feels tense.
And in that moment, as you're starting to get those bodily feelings, what is the negative thought you have about yourself?
It's being the hunted, and being helpless and not knowing that you can't do anything about it. There is no escape.
Right. So she is using the protocol of EMDR. And one of the elements is, of course, in this moment, they're not doing the eye movement thing. There is an investigation of how do you feel? How do you feel when you're about to, so he's talking about when he's landing, he's arriving to London on a plane, he has this distressful feeling, and he's like, is it fear? And in that moment, the therapist is giving him a chance to explore himself while someone cares about him, while someone doesn't judge him. And in that moment, both the therapist is caring for him and he is caring for himself. And this is part of what heals, is we will have feelings and we get uptight and we just stuff them. But when we can talk about them and take care of ourselves, the analogy or the example that I give about this is you get mugged on the street. And instead of immediately going to the police officer and telling a story, instead of going to your family and going, oh my God, I was mugged today, instead of going on Facebook and saying, I was mugged today, instead of the next day when at work, you wouldn't be the craziest thing, I was mugged last night. It was really scary for me. So imagine you don't do any of that because of shame, because of some other thing. You can't express those feelings. You don't feel like you can. And you just stuff them. And the layers upon layers of emotions just build and build and build and build, and it becomes a mountain. Some people have been stuffing their feelings since they were born. So imagine the amount of feelings that have left to be expressed and healed from. So again, if we just think about this one instance of being mugged, that's just one event that is difficult. And if you can't talk about it, that because you just want to talk about it, you just gotta, and you might be talking about it for a couple weeks. A month or two later, you might run into your cousin and be like, you're talking about things. How are things? Well, actually, a couple months ago, I was mugged. Why do we want to say that? It's not just because we're trying to be entertaining for someone. It's because we have to talk about it. It's important for us to express ourselves and hear ourselves talk, but also to have a caring other take care of us. We are not independent people. We are a social creature. We depend on other people. We need other people. It's normal to need other people. That's why therapists are in such high demand, because so few people have someone to talk to. And so part of it, the therapy, is working right here. And this is within the EMDR model, but it's also in several other models, by the way, including my version of flexible prolonged exposure, where you can unpack these feelings and you can have a chance to talk about it a little bit. Because for Harry, the feeling is the trauma. As he's landing, he's having this feeling and it doesn't feel good. And he's not feeling good because of past traumas, but the trauma is compounding because every time he's landing in the plane, he's going like this, but he's not able to talk about it. So he's unpacking those feelings, talking about it, he's getting some care. And then the therapist asks, and how do you feel about yourself? This is a part of the EMDR model and a part of many other models of therapy, humanistic psychodynamic therapy as well, cognitive therapy to some extent, of when you have that feeling, how do you judge yourself? It's what meaning, existential therapists, also narrative therapists might have these kinds of questions as well, of like, what story are you telling yourself because you're having that feeling? And a lot of people will say, I'm weak, or there's something wrong with me. And so that is, again, it's another layer of trauma. Instead of just like, hey, I'm having a feeling, let me tell everyone, and I'm okay to have this feeling. Then we're able to heal and move on. So this is great that they're showing this kinds of work.
There is no way out of this.
So let's say I'm helpless.
Yeah.
I'm helpless. So when you think back on that moment and you think I'm helpless, what would you prefer to believe about yourself now?
I'm not helpless. It's only for a brief moment of time. You're living your life by truth, so there's nothing to be afraid of. There's nothing to be worried about.
So this is great. This is another part of EMDR. It's also a part of my flexible prolonged exposure, in that there's an element of, well, what story would you like to say to yourself? What meaning would you like to have? That was the meaning you had back then when you were just thinking in the moment. But when you think about it now, what's the story that you'd like to say? What seems like a more accurate story? And Harry is saying, well, I think the more accurate story is, I'm not weak. There isn't something wrong with me. It's totally normal that I would be terrified and fearful landing in London because of all the terrible things that have happened to me in that town. And actually, I'm kind of strong. The fact that I even, survived all that kind of stuff, and I'm a human being. So it's a different meaning. It's a different story. And when we have a different story, then we heal. Not only with our memories get rewired, if you will, but also when we have that. So the next time he is having that feeling as he's landing in London, he has that feeling, he'll say, oh, it's okay for me to have this feeling. It's normal for me to have this feeling. And the feeling will become 3% what it would have become if he was trying to stuff it and shame himself and feel terrible and not have anyone to talk to about it. So it's wonderful that they're demonstrating that as well.
Just notice what emotions are coming up now.
The sensation I was feeling was sadness.
Okay, and where do you notice this in your body?
Yeah.
She's doing wonderful work, and we don't often see good examples of therapy on TV. In fact, I would say 99.9% of the depictions of therapy on TV and movies, particularly fictional depictions, are terrible, terrible. So we want to look at this and say, this is what therapists actually act like.
It just comes back to the old the trauma is very much geographical.
Okay, just go with that. Just notice.
So yeah, she's following the EMDR protocol, which is, a wonderful opportunity for everyone to see. This is what EMDR looks like. It's not some weird mystical thing. It just looks like this. And I will say, my form of therapy, I won't have them do this particular activity. What I will have them do is talk about it. He is doing this and he's thinking about it. That's the protocol. Is he does this thing while he thinks about it until something else emerges for him, and then he is asked a question, now what's going on? And then the therapist says, okay, go with that, meaning because they have a lot of rapport. They've done this before. And so he knows, okay, she's asking me to concentrate on that and to think about that and to see where my mind goes there. And then the next step is, okay, now where are you? And then he says that, and okay, go with that. So this is the EMDR protocol. But in my protocol, it's a lot of talking. So I would say, where are you? What do you think about that? And he would explore, and then he would go, oh, actually, I'm here now. And then I'd say, well, tell me more about that. And then he would, so it's not him thinking on his own. It's him talking out loud, and we're having a conversation, which has the same function as this, according to me anyway.
Intention, but it cleans my hard drive. It's literally like every time something comes up, we're done with that.
Great. Yeah, that's also the goal. Great. So let's...
Yeah, and that's the idea. And a lot of people will report that is, as something comes up, you do the protocol, you focus on that, and it'll just go away. And you can have similar results through imaginal exposure and exploration in therapy through a corrective experience with a secure attachment.
You want to talk about history repeating itself? They're not going to stop until she dies. It's incredibly triggering to potentially lose another woman in my life. So the list is growing.
Right, that constant triggering for him that he's talking about. And we've talked about this before in other videos with Harry, that for him, he lost his mother in a very traumatic way, a very violent way. And he naturally and understandably, rationally, blames the media and society for the way that they treated his mom, not only in the media, but also by chasing and harassing and abusing. It's abuse. Imagine someone's in your face and yelling at you and not giving you space. It's abusive. And he was upset about it then, and then after the death, he understandably blamed them for that. So his world in the royal family didn't change after that. It was even more cameras on him, even more cameras. Then he is with Meghan, and even more cameras, and all the while, constant triggering of that trauma with his mom's death. constant reminders of there's the enemy. It'd be akin to you are sexually assaulted by someone at work or at school or in your family, and you have to experience that person on a daily basis. Oh, there they are again. And, that triggering feeling that you would have naturally when you see that person again. So it makes total sense that there would be a lot of emotional toll on him and that he would be very motivated to get out of that world.
That doesn't make sense. Just because you suffered, that doesn't mean that your kids have to suffer. In fact, quite the opposite. If you suffered, do everything you can to make sure that whatever negative experiences that you had, that you can make it right for your kids.
Yes, and good for Harry for making that choice, which is essentially what Harry did. So Harry said, I'm not going to put my kids through what I went through. But at the same time, when you're treated a certain way as a child, as Charles was, it just becomes normalized. And you just think, well, this is just how the world is. And this is our duty. This is our culture. This is our way. People need us to be this way, and we will be this way for society because they want us to be the stable royals that always stand tall. And that's what I'm supposed to. I'm not defending Charles. I'm not defending the royal family at all. But I think if Charles was able to go to therapy and really explore his issues, I'm guessing that we would find there's a lot of sympathy for him and why he lived the life that he has.
Because we hadn't done this before and no one had done this before, we gave a low dose to know that they could tolerate a higher dose that we.
Okay, so psilocybin research, psychedelic therapy. I have done a whole episode with a researcher, and you can listen to that audio episode, Psychedelic Therapy, I believe it's called. And there's some promising research. And we're at the beginning stages, and if you listen to the expert that I talked to that's actually doing the research, we have a hard time drawing any conclusions based on the early phases of research. Unfortunately, in psychology and psychotherapy and psychiatry, it takes decades for us to get enough data for us to conclude anything. And from the experts that I've talked to, we're in the very early stages of psychedelic research. Because in the U.S., there were legal problems regarding using psychedelics in research, and so it was avoided for decades. And now we're in the beginning stages. We should have been doing this research, and we did start doing this research in the 50s and 60s, but it was, for the most part, halted after Nixon and all these other. Anyway, point is that we're in the beginning phases, and that's good. We're working hard. We're gathering the data. There's some promising results that seem to indicate we need more research. But the thing to understand for clinicians and for the lay public is that we don't really know much yet. And there seem to be some promising results for treatment-resistant depression, which I think they're demonstrating here, for people who are suffering from a chronic or from a terminal illness, physical illness, meaning that they have cancer and they're likely to die within 6 to 12 months. There can be some positive results from psychedelics that can help them to feel more accepting of their last days on the planet. There seem to be some promising results with trauma. But again, as with EMDR that I talked about earlier, the psychedelics, it's not like you just throw psychedelics or psilocybin or mushrooms or LSD or some other drug at the person and they go home and everything's better. It's a whole protocol. There's a lot of sessions before you do it. There's a lot of care while you're doing. The therapist is, at least the protocols that I know of, the therapist, so there's 2 therapists that are sitting right there with the client as they're going through their trip. There's aftercare, there's sessions later, there's discussions, there's talk. So it's not just the psychedelics. So a lot of the headlines in today's news or on Reddit or something is, people take mushrooms and it solves their trauma. These are oversimplifications at best, if not just flat out lies, because we just don't have the data to really know exactly what's going on. there are many examples in my field where a new drug will come out, and I'm old enough to remember when Prozac became very popular, or other kinds of drugs will come out, and there will be very, very promising results. We're just like, oh my goodness. Like when Prozac came out in SSRI, the early talk for 10, 20 years was it's a happy pill. Not only will it just eliminate depression, it'll eliminate anxiety, but even if you're just mildly depressed and you just aren't having a good day, boom, take a Prozac and you will feel better. It will solve all of our problems. Well, the data seemed to almost suggest that in the beginning because the signal was so high. As we've continued to research it, the signal has gotten smaller and smaller. SSRIs do help some people, but the margin of difference between the control group and placebo is not that large. There's a it helps for some people, but meaning that they will give a control group placebo and not tell them that they're giving a placebo, and then they'll give the treatment group the SSRI or the antidepressant, and then they compare the two groups as to what the difference is. And there's not that much of a difference. I can't remember the exact percentages. So in the beginning, large differences. Now we're looking at, well, it's actually not that much of a difference anymore. There's a difference, and I'm wondering if with psychedelics it'll be similar to that. Right now we're seeing large effect sizes, and as time goes on, we might see diminishing. And I suspect that in 20, 30 years, psychedelics will be one of a dozen plus different medications or protocols that we will have in our toolbox to treat people with their issues that they come to therapy with, depending on what the presenting problem is. And for some, SSRIs will work, and for others, they won't work. And for some, psychedelics might work. For others, talk therapy might work, or a combination. And so I say all that because a lot of people out there will ask me, because they've been brainwashed by the media and the internet and Reddit, and they're like, is our mushrooms going to solve all of our mental health problems? No, not likely. I mean, I would hope for that. If that's true, then yes, I will welcome that 100%. But, let's just wait for the data to come in.
Where challenges don't have to live in the dark, where vulnerability is healthy and encouraged, and of course, where physical and mental health can be treated equally because they are one. We're going to hear some personal stories from a number of incredibly brave people, and we'll also be joined by our advisory board, many of the world's top experts in mental health.
All right, well, that does it for that episode of Psychology in Seattle. Everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.